Hello, everyone. My name is Elise Laird. I am the CEO of Amplify Consulting, and joining me today, we are talking about National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. And my friend Ryan Denault of Healing Between Worlds is joining me today. We're going to have a bit of a conversation of questions that I've wanted to know the answers to as we lead into this very important day and how we can commemorate that well. So, Ryan, welcome. And maybe if you could share a little bit of information about yourself as a bit of an introduction.
Sure. Thanks, Elise. I'm really happy to be here today to have this conversation with you. My name's Ryan Denault. I'm a fourth generation settler in the interior of British Columbia and a Skitcheston band member. My grandmother and grandfather on my Indigenous side are Anne and Albert Denault. And my grandfather and grandmother on my British side are Dave and Mary Askew. My father is Wally Denault and my mother was Helen Askew. And I come to you today from the traditional territory of the Secwepemc here in Kamloops, British Columbia.
Awesome. So, Ryan, you and I chat often, but why is it when you introduce yourself, why do you acknowledge who your parents and your grandparents are?
Um, That's a great question. I think everything that you do as you introduce yourself is an opportunity for connection. And when you're dealing with people in community and you've been in community for a long time, people have interactions with your family that you don't necessarily know about. And so introducing yourself and talking about your grandparents and talking about your parents, it allows opportunity for people to connect with you through those people in your family, through those important people in your family. And so really for me, it's all about connection. Every time I introduce myself like this in meetings or at community events, there's always two or three people that come up to me and talk about my grandfather, talk about the grandfather on my British side, or my father on my Indigenous, side. And they always bring me stories that sort of enrich my understanding even of my own family sometimes, because my family doesn't talk about some of the things that they've done in community over the years. So it's this really beautiful way to connect with people. And I do find that if people know somebody in your family and they come up and they talk to you and they tell you a story, you already have like some street credit, before you even start your interaction with those people. So yeah, I always find it to be quite a blessing, and it's always so interesting to see who comes up and what stories I get to hear about different parts of my family.
That's awesome. So, when your daughter introduces herself, are people like, your dad's Ryan Denault? I've played hockey against him.
Yeah, she hears that the odd time.
Yeah, I get that usually when my kids are in town or they find out that I'm their mom. It's like, oh, my mom or so and so's played soccer against your mom, and I'm like, oh no, that's
I
awesome.
actually got that last night. One of actually Kirkby Casimir's husband said that he played hockey with my dad when he was 19 years old, and my dad was quite a bit older.
Oh,
So
that's
again, I would have never known that. Then we started talking because I was in those dressing rooms. I would have been 10, 11 years old at that time. So I was running around the rink when my dad was playing hockey. So I probably sort of knew who he was when we were,
yeah.
when we were young, right? Yeah, it's funny.
That's awesome. Well, then let me take an opportunity. I know you already know a lot of my background, but I operate Amplify Consulting, which is on the traditional and ancestral territory of the Tecumseh
There you go.
Secwepemc. And I actually have this picture behind me. Oh, I'll reach back. This is of my Oma and Opa, Harmon and Hilly Dopp. And so I'm a first generation Canadian. My Oma and Opa came over, they immigrated to Canada after the World War. There wasn't a lot of opportunity there for them. And my Tanta Dini married a Canadian soldier and wrote to my Oma saying, Hilly, you and Harmon should come over. There's lots of opportunity in Canada. It did mean that they were living in a converted chicken coop for much of their beginnings in Canada. So came from a humble beginning. But I actually keep that picture behind me because on Zoom meetings and Teams meetings, I really like the fact that they're over my shoulder because it reminds me of my history, my heritage, and the resiliency of my ancestors. So I'm very proud of them. So that's a little bit about me. And I'm Dutch and I'm tall and et cetera, et cetera. Awesome. Well, we're sharing this video because our team at Amplify Consulting has done training with you learning about the history of Canada through an Indigenous lens, which has been awesome. It's been like, and I actually am not, I'm not even just underselling it. I need to oversell it. It has been transformational in the work that I have had the opportunity to do and our team has with First Nations people. And I think the more that you know and the time that you take to learn about others and their backgrounds and their history and what motivates them and what they're inspired by creates those connections that you talk about. So I think this is the second or third year maybe that National Day of Truth and Reconciliation has actually been a federal holiday. So people in Canada get the day off. So I thought it would be a really good opportunity to actually talk with you about what this day is about, because I know a lot of non-Indigenous people don't have an understanding as to how to commemorate this and like, what do I do? What do I say? So I think this is a good conversation for us to have so that we can maybe shed a little bit more light on this important day and how we can commemorate that.
Yeah, National Truth and Reconciliation Day is a very interesting day for myself personally. I'm the colonizer and the colonized. And so I have a very unique perspective on days like this. And if you really want to get to the blunt and obvious statements about who I am, I'm a successful uh, I'm a successful end result of the Indian Act. I'm assimilated Indian. I'm now half British and half Indigenous. I was raised, my grandmother, um, Annie Deneault. My grandfather passed away when my dad was 5 years old. And Annie at that time was living out at Skeetcheston because they had moved out there when they got married. And my grandfather died in a railway accident, but he was technically not working. And so she didn't get the death benefit and ended up having to give up her status as an Indian in order to get any services from the federal government or any assistance or what we would call oh shoot, what is it called? It's not unemployment insurance. It's
Oh my goodness. Not welfare.
welfare, what we would
Okay.
call like
Okay.
what we call welfare today.
Okay.
And she ended up having to move off reserve and into Kamloops. And so, that began this disconnection from the reserve for our family. And honestly, my dad and my aunties and uncles, they didn't go to residential school. They went to school District 73. And so we got completely disconnected from that part of our roots as a family. And by the time I was born, there was no customs, there was no tradition, there was no language in the home, none of that. And so, now that we're coming into these years later on in my life where we're starting to recognize these things, and I had a lifelong battle with addiction, mainly because I didn't really know where I fit in society. I didn't really feel like I fit on the reserve. I didn't really feel like I fit off the reserve. And when I was on the reserve, I was considered white, and when I was off the reserve, I was considered Indigenous. It's a very strange place to grow up. And so I think when I see what's happening today, and I see all this expansion of people wanting to understand and wanting to learn and wanting to know what happened in our past, and try to start to make sense of it and possibly reconcile with it. It's days like Truth and Reconciliation Day that allow us that opportunity to take a deep breath, and have a day where we can sort of spend some time thinking about what happened to us in the past, and where we're going to go in the future. So I think one of the things that where it gets really important for me is when I start to see people really start to take on understanding the truth of our history. And
Hmm.
that Indigenous truth is much different than the one that's been portrayed for most of my life from the government of Canada. And we know now that that's a very different thing. And it's honestly time for us to take it upon ourselves to learn as much as we can about what happened in this country, and how Indigenous people have been treated, so that we can have a bit of an understanding, a bit more empathy for what they might be going through today. Because to somebody that doesn't understand the past, this looks like a group of people that just don't care, and are just running roughshod through our communities, and they're addicted, and they're having all of these traumatic experiences, but it looks like aggression, and it looks like all these different things that we might judge or put a person down because of how they're struggling. And I think we really need to change that narrative. And that starts with trying to have an understanding of the truth of our history.
Hmm. And I think that's really good because one of the things that you do in your course, and that I've heard, I was a part of Day One Society. They did a meeting with Joanne Brown, and she talked about her family and her history. And it was really awesome the way that she started it out is that she's like, there's no guilt, there's no judgment in this. I'm sharing the history so that you can better understand. And I was like, that's a really great way of putting it because, I mean, when you talk to people, you could take me, for example, and say, well, I'm a first generation Canadian. My family came here from Holland. And so we had nothing to do with what happened. But at the same time, it's building that understanding so that you can relate to people and you can build those relationships because you come from a place of understanding as opposed to, well, it has nothing to do with me. That doesn't help a situation.
What's been the most interesting about doing this training and doing the history training, the cultural safety training with different organizations and community is that I end up having these really interesting conversations with people that are first generation settlers in Canada. Many times we're about halfway through the training and they'll start to have these physical reactions and they start to get upset. And, I've had a couple of them that felt safe enough to talk about why they were starting to get upset, and every single time it's like I thought I moved to this totally different country than what I'm now immersing myself in. I thought Canada was this country that didn't colonize and didn't take advantage of the Indigenous people that were in the country when they arrived, and they did the same thing. They did the same thing that they did in my country, and people get visibly sort of shaken by the fact that that's the case because I don't think Canada is always seen as a country that has done what they've done and attempted to assimilate a people. It's disheartening for people sometimes when they first move to the country and find these things out.
And I think it's disheartening too, having grown up in our education system. I mean, I graduated a long time ago, but we really, like, there was just the tiniest little bit of First Nations history in our education system. Um, and it was, I should look back at what the textbooks are. And it was just a very kind of like, here's a little bit of a dribble of it, but based from a European perspective as opposed to based from a First Nations perspective. So I think it's interesting now that there's so much more that is happening within the school system to bring about that understanding. If you don't embrace the truth of history, it's really hard to move forward as in a better way. And how do we learn the lessons from our past to move forward?
Yeah, and if you're not transparent about what you've been through, then you get it's a slippery slope to have that happen again in your country if you're not paying attention.
Yeah.
And I think I think the last few years has been a real cardinal shift in understanding and people actually wanting to reach out and wanting to know now. And unfortunately, it had to be something like the missing that were found at the Chemist Residential School, and then have that's perpetuated from them being found now at all the different residential schools all across the country. And I think that now you're really seeing individuals that aren't Indigenous that are looking at that and going, wait a minute,
Mhm.
what if that was my 4 year old?
Yeah.
Wait a minute, what if I was that 5 year old? And I was going through these things, and you start hearing the horror stories of what happened to the Indigenous people throughout that whole process, and it's just devastating. And get past the different physical and sexual abuses and the things that really stick out and really hurt, the systematic way those schools went about business, taking away custom, taking away language. There's stories of Indigenous children having their tongues pulled out and needles placed through them because they're speaking their own language, and these different things that were happening. It like, don't get stuck on the real tragic abuses. There was also a systematic fundamental abuse of assimilation that needs to be recognized. It was very purposeful, it was very deliberate. And we need to have an understanding of that so that we can have a look at how 2 and 3 generations later these families are still struggling immensely with what happened to them. And we need to have more empathy so that we can try to understand that and try to assist when we're asked.
Hmm. Absolutely. And I think that's always the thing is putting yourself in the place of others who have gone through that. So having kids of my own, thinking when Mac and Cal were just young boys, like what would that have been like? And you just like you it makes you cringe, and then you put yourself in the place of what it would have been like for First Nations people to have this happen to their communities. And I can see why, as a non-Indigenous person, not often, but sometimes when I go into scenarios where I may not know the protocols or the customs of a First Nation, where I have had some people like go, "You need to learn this," and there's kind of that reaction to me, even though I'm trying to learn as well. But I think I've chatted with you about that before too, and it's like when you consider the fact that some of these people have such trauma, I think you called it like a trauma response what to what I'm asking or what I'm saying. So maybe share a bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to go back again to the understanding of what's happened in the last 100 years, and specifically in this area. So if we're talking about the Kamloops area, people are like, well, that wasn't 100 years ago. I'm like, but the residential school itself opened in 1929.
Yeah.
It's 2024.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's 100 years. And so, how many generations is that? Four generations, right? Of individuals.
Yeah.
And imagine that you're in this situation in the 20s, 30s, and 40s where the government of Canada doesn't even recognize you as a human being. You're not able to take anybody to court. You have no right to vote. You have no right for decision making in your own processes of the way that you want to live your life. And then you have a government agent, a person from the police, from the RCMP, and an individual from the church coming to take your children away from you for 12 years.
Mm-hmm.
Those are all the pillars of the foundation of what makes us feel safe in this country. And those are the people that are taking your children away.
Yeah.
So 100 years later, do you think that your family is going to have, your grandmother that went through that and your parent that went through that as a day scholar, and then you're sitting here yourself? Do you think that those individuals are going to tell you that you should trust the systems and the things that are in place in Canada? That they're there for you and that they're there to protect you? No,
Mm-hmm.
that's not how that looks. That's not how that feels for Indigenous individuals. And once we recognize that, then you can have a little more empathy about why they get skittish or why they get defensive or why they have these generational trauma responses to simple words that we're saying that we don't realize are triggering this fundamental feeling of not feeling safe.
Yeah. I
And
love
when
that.
you feel that disheartened, can you imagine how you wouldn't numb? Like who would not numb in this situation? Who would not use? Who would not drink? You show me those people, and I'd want to know them because that would be a pretty spectacular individual. I
Yeah.
think most people, regardless of race, would have a really hard time not abusing something to numb the pain of having their children taken away.
Absolutely. And I think that's the thing is because of the learning that I've been doing with having conversations with you and having taken your training as well, is that it in a scenario like that, it actually helps me to come to it from a place of understanding and not react in a way where like, well, I'm just trying. It's more like, okay, and coming at it more in a gentle way, more of a gentle way than I would normally react, going, I understand why this person is reacting to me and a seemingly simple question that I've asked or something that I've said. um, and it just makes it better so that you can have a conversation and walk through that. This one individual that I'm thinking of, um, we have a great relationship and we have some amazing talks, and we were doing a project where they were able to open up and share so much of their story, which was, from what I learned, just the trauma of residential school. It terrible. And so then I go, okay, we're building this trust, and it's building this relationship, even though at the beginning it was kind of like this, well, kind of like this. When you take the opportunity to just to step back and go, okay, I am trying to understand and I hear you, I think it makes it better. And I think that's for a lot of people really to understand, in that it's you're you need to put yourself in the other person's shoes sometimes to know why they're coming at you the way that they are, as opposed to just going, well, forget it. I'm never going to try this again, because that's also problematic too.
It's only problematic, but it's a natural reaction when you don't get the response or when you don't understand the response you're getting and it's negative, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And a lot of that comes from it comes from ignorance, but it's not because you had the opportunity to understand and you just chose not to through your life. If you
Hmm.
lived in Canada, I'm 51 years old. I'm a guy, so I can say how old I am. So I'm 51 years,
Yeah,
right? When I was in my 20s, nobody taught like you didn't even know that this happened. Like
totally.
it wasn't until university that I was in university for about a year and a half, and I went to a Native Women Studies course because I wanted to have a bit more of an understanding of what my grandmother had gone through. And I sort of, I thought, well, this would be an interesting course. Even in that course, it was like when I look back, it was just scratching the surface. Like it was yeah, it was so tamed and so vanilla in the reality of really what was going on in our
Yeah.
country at that time.
Yeah.
And again, I'm assimilated at that time. I have no culture. I'm not really welcome on the reserve. I don't have any interaction there. And so as I'm learning this stuff, I'm thinking, oh wow, here I am. I'm starting to understand. I'm starting to understand what's happened to this half of my people. And yet it wasn't until years and years and years later, like in this last 5 years, where I've really started to be able to kind of come back to my community, and I'm accepted now in a different way. And again, I think part of that is because of a lot of what's opened up in these last 5 years since the missing were found. I think things are changing everywhere exponentially and very quickly, right?
Yeah, and thank God for that, right? It's becoming
Hmm.
better, but I mean, then you run into situations or scenarios where you're like, oh, we still have such a long way to go. Yeah, people, right? We're all
Well, you know
people,
what?
we're all trying.
Honestly, I I struggle with this sometimes. How, I where I found my comfort and how I found my comfort in all of this was my realization early on in my recovery from addiction, which was around 2020. So in the last 3 or 4 years, was that when I realized the moment that I realized that I didn't necessarily fit on the reserve, I didn't necessarily fit off the reserve. I'm a bridge in between those two worlds. And like that's the whole seed of what started with this organization and how I started healing between worlds was actually that's a personal journey that I'm on. And I'm just walking alongside anybody that wants to walk alongside me and anybody that wants to learn as I'm learning. And I've got a decent way of being able to turn that into opportunities for others to have safe space to learn and understand. But like I'm becoming somebody that people look to for learning and for understanding of these ways, and yet I'm not I don't have a traditional indigenous background, so like it's an interesting place to be where you're being asked to have this understanding of things, and yet I'm still finding that understanding within myself. And
Hmm.
I think that's why people probably resonate with me, is because I'm really open about that. Like I'm not the end answer, but I can spark the beginning of your journey to try to find that truth and try to find that place of finding a way that you can reconcile this within yourself and then reconcile this within your community and hopefully reconcile in helping the way that you engage and the way that you interact with Indigenous people moving forward.
That's awesome. And I think that's the thing is that if we can all just share that we're all still learning, I think things that we say that maybe are often inappropriate or we come from it as a place of ignorance, it's giving this. I always talk about with my boys like the grace and the space. Like give people the grace that they may not understand and give them the space to be able to learn. Otherwise, when you when you attack somebody, when you don't give them room to grow, and when they don't take that grace for themselves to go, okay, man, I really messed that up, but I want to try, then it doesn't create a space for learning. So I agree. I think that's one of the great things about you, one of many, is that you are also very vulnerable on this journey of learning, which is it makes at least I think it made me and it makes others feel like, oh, I can ask I can ask the dumb question, or I can ask something that may be insensitive because I'm not going to be looked at as an idiot. So I think that's important.
Well, it is important, and I think one of the greatest things that we can do as people that are starting to understand this, and people that are Indigenous or split race like myself, but really have that passion with the Indigenous side of our upbringing. Um, I think it's really important that we do as much of the work as we can to get ourselves healed as much as we can, because that's where we can start creating safe space for others to learn and grow and start to have allies and partnerships with people that we wouldn't necessarily have had we not been healthy enough to show them why this is such a tragic moment in our history.
Hmm. That's awesome. Um, when we talk about National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, I really, because being in communications, I really like words and words matter. I really like how it's framed, and I want you to talk a little bit about this. So it's National Day, so it's nationwide day, and it's a day that we commemorate. It's one full day of truth and reconciliation. So maybe talk a little bit about why it's so important to know the truth first before reconciliation can come about.
Sure. Yeah, honestly, one of the interesting parts about from my perspective, from what I saw once those children were found at the Camas Residential School, I mean, that really shifted. There's a quantum shift. I think even more so than just the country of Canada. Like that was worldwide news. And a lot of things have been changing since that moment of that clear understanding that this happened.
Hmm.
Um, uh, what I saw after that was I saw a lot of people come together, and I saw a lot of people that wanted to do something. And, in that colonized way of thinking, we're doers. Like it's just like we
Yeah,
want to get on that train and we want to go, right?
yeah.
And sometimes we have really great intentions about what we want to do. And people were trying to, well, I want to reconcile, I want to engage with Indigenous people, I want to do all this stuff. And I would be like, okay, wait a minute. Like, so what happened? And they were like, what are you reconciling? And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, why are you reconciling with Indigenous people? Well, because I mean, I think it's an important thing to do. And I said, okay, what happened to them? And it's crickets. They
Yeah.
don't know. So if you don't have an understanding of what happened to Indigenous people since 1867, and if you don't have an understanding of how they walk in the world before the colonizers came, and how they were stewards of this land for 10,000 years, and it stayed healthy and vibrant and beautiful. And in the last 200 years, maybe 400 years, but it really started maybe in 15, 1600 when they started taking away all the furs and taking away all that. But it's really in the last 200 years, now that we're extracting resources the way that we are, this is terrifying for Indigenous people. It's like the colonizers, it took them 300 years to ruin something that was beautiful for 10,000 plus years. And honestly, for millions of years, right? And so, like, let's have an understanding of what the truth of that means to Indigenous people, and then everything that we've done to them to try to assimilate them into our community, and all the different things that have happened, taking children away, and all those different things. Once you have an understanding of all of that, and then you start to gain an understanding of what the Indigenous worldview is and why that stewardship of land is so important, then you can look at that and go, okay, now how do we align with reconciling with that? Now that I have an understanding of how important the land is, now that I have an understanding of what was taken away over the last 100 years, now I can critically look at what we're doing in our society and see how we can align and become more aligned with Indigenous people, and really, help them become healthy enough to become the stewards again.
Hmm. I love that. So then my question for you is if someone who is maybe non-Indigenous, who hasn't done the work, doesn't know the truth, but wants to reconcile, or is coming into this, like, how do we make this day coming up not just oh, it's a long weekend, awesome, I'm going to go camping, I'm going to do this, get extra stuff done around the house. I mean, which is great. It's great for people to have a rest and time of refreshment. um, but what can non-Indigenous people do um, to commemorate this day in a meaningful way?
Well, first of all, I think regardless of what community you're in, like it would be great to look outside of yourself and see what is out there around your community. And for example, in Kamloops, the Tecumseh Language and Culture Department and their museum, they run tours through the residential school, and they talk about everything that happened there. I think it's less than $20. Like
Mm,
it's not, it's not a large amount. They're there to help people gain an understanding of what happened right here in Kamloops. And like if you're in this community, I would start with the residential school. That at one time was the largest residential school in Canada. If you want to start with the birthplace of what really started to damage Indigenous people, this is the place to start your learning. And there's a lot of information online about the residential schools. There's a lot of information at your, at the library, the museums in your community. They're going to have this information in there. And, it's a really great place to start. I don't want, I'm always uncomfortable like doing the big promo. And I know you always
yeah.
get mad at me about it, but honestly, if you're in
I don't
the
know if I get
community of
mad, but
Kamloops, you can reach out to Healing Between Worlds, because we have partnerships in community where we're now allowing anybody from community to come in and get a view of the history of Canada through an Indigenous lens. And I'm aligned with the Chamber of Commerce here in Kamloops, and 3 to 4 times a year we offer this out to community. And so start looking for different things like that, in this community or outside of that community, outside of the community. There's all kinds of learning tools and resources out there now if you really want to understand.
mhm.
And don't take it upon Indigenous people to do this for you.
Mm,
Like start doing this for yourself. I'm here to help anybody that wants to do the work, but I'm not here to hold people's hand. Like you need to want this now in order to be placed in front of the people that are there to help you learn and understand. And if you're willing to do the work, there's all kinds of Indigenous people that are waiting with open arms to help you in that endeavor. And you know what? As you go through this, you are going to run into Indigenous people that aren't as healed as others, and they are going to be blaming the outside world for what's happened to them. And in many ways, they have a lot of right to do that. And so, as you run into those, try not to let that discourage you, and try to hold space for them to allow them to have that experience, and try not to take it personally. And if there's something deliberate that you've done, take ownership of that and apologize, and then move forward.
I mean, this is the thing is like the older I get, the more I learn, the more I look back on what I learned in kindergarten as like the things that we should really do. Is like be kind to one another, share, listen, apologize when you've done wrong. I mean, it's these basic principles, but I think that there is this kind of intimidation factor where people are kind of that intimidation of like, I want to know more about National Day of Truth and Reconciliation or National Day of Indigenous People or Red Dress Day, Moose Hide Campaign, these things, but they just feel like there's this wall that's going to be there. But personally, I have found exactly what you're saying is that there are Indigenous people who have their arms wide open to say, yeah, we want to teach and we want to share. So I feel like it will be exactly what you said, Ryan, for people to take that first step before and to take the ownership of their learning and that truth that they need to take hold of, really.
Yeah, and I mean, like if you're truly wanting to identify where you can assist in reconciliation in this overwhelming situation that we're in, um, making sure that you do the research that you need to do to understand what the different ways of engagement are between an Indigenous and a non-Indigenous person is really important before you reach out.
Mm,
Having an understanding of how they would like to be talked to and how they would like to be reached. Like, how do you want me to reach out? How would this is what I'm thinking, you know and having that ability to go in there and just ask these open-ended questions, so that the Indigenous group or the Indigenous business or the Indigenous person has the opportunity to lead how they would like to go through that engagement process. And far too often we just assume that, like, having that colonial way of engaging and that really strong way of engaging is the way that everybody wants to engage. That's actually not the truth at all.
hmm
A lot of the times the way that we engage with each other, in Canadian society would be taken as being something that would be very aggressive in Indigenous culture.
Yeah.
You know, that strong eye contact and that strong handshake. I mean, those things are not they're not taken as like we take that as a sign of respect. Like I respect you, so I'm going to look at you and I'm going to make give you a strong handshake and make sure you know that I'm focused in on you. For an Indigenous person, that's like almost a sign of war.
Mm,
When you make eye contact like that and you shake someone's hand strong, that's being aggressive. That's showing that you have power over that person. And so those are things that you need to understand before you go into these conversations, because you're going to unknowingly offend someone.
yeah.
Now, the handshake is a little bit different because most Indigenous people know now that that's not what a non-Indigenous person is trying to do, but you still don't have to put that person in that spot.
Yeah.
You know, you can
Yeah.
learn how they would like, you can learn these simple basic things about how they'd like to be interacted with in the beginning, and then just ask these open-ended questions and don't be afraid to fall forward. I always talk about falling forward. Like you're going to make mistakes, things are going to happen, you're going to offend people accidentally. It's okay. Fall down, get back up, dust yourself off, apologize if you recognize what you've done. And if you haven't, hopefully at some point soon, like you'll understand why that reaction happened. And sometimes that reaction has nothing to do with you.
Yeah.
Like, this trauma runs deep. And sometimes, you've triggered somebody, just your presence has. And
Yeah.
so, that's got to be okay too.
I had shared with you that we were working with a First Nation, and some of the the men, I was there, and they were teasing me, and I came back and I told you, I'm like, they were calling me names, like not bad names, but they were like calling me names, and you're like, oh, they like you. That you've crossed this threshold. If they're teasing you and giving you a hard time on things, I'm like, oh, okay. So it's just, yeah, I think that's the thing, is that it's learning the culture and protocols, and just and falling forward, like being willing to be like, I'm just learning, and I think that's a good way to approach it.
Well, and once you start to immerse yourself, and at least you found this because we've had these conversations, and I love that you brought up the humor and the softness and the that banter that goes back and forth between Indigenous people and community. When you see that healthy, vibrant group, and I had the experience, like last night, I had the experience of, yeah, I was invited to the Central Interior First Nations Community Futures event, and they were honoring some board members that had been volunteering for the organization for, one was for 25 years and the other two were for 34 years. And the people that were there to recognize and honor them were some of the healthiest people in community, like in our community right now. And so I happened to get invited to this, and um, watching the banter. And one of the guys there, he'd been of service for 25 years, and there were chiefs that were at this event last night, and there were other really heavy hitters in the Indigenous community, and they're all bagging on him,
Yeah.
like they're just giving it to him the
Yeah.
whole time, and they're honoring him, right?
Yeah.
And it's just like it's almost a roast, like
Hmm.
it's almost gets to that point. And the laughs and the way that we go through that, like it's not as, those events are very different than the colonized events, which are very strict about the protocols of how. It's just not like that
Yeah.
in community. And once you get to a healthy community, you can start to see, where this could go if we could back things up a little bit and allow time for Indigenous people to heal and provide opportunity for them to succeed, and you see them rise back up in this healthy way. Because what you have to remember is the ones that are here now, they have survived something that no person should have to survive.
Hmm.
And there's a lot of strength in that. If they're resilient enough to survive this and then sober themselves up and provide themselves with healthy opportunity, and obviously that provides health for generations after them. They're breaking these cycles. Like, let's give them time to do that and then see what they can do to come back, and assist us in really sort of decolonizing ourselves in some ways, and rebuilding systems in a way that aligns with all of our values. Because I think every one of us can admit that our systems right now are not serving us the way that we thought that they were going to.
Yeah.
And you're watching things in community break down right now. Our healthcare system, our child and welfare systems, our like all these systems, even our banking systems and the way that we're doing things, like you can tell that this isn't serving us anymore. And yet we're so attached to that way because it's the only way we know. We've got to shift. And I honestly think healthy indigenous communities can help us find a better way so that
Mm.
we can sustain ourselves for hundreds of years again without raping and pillaging our land, and we can still do that in a way that's healthy and vibrant, and we can find these really great ways to still be successful and wealthy. Maybe the wealth doesn't look exactly the same in this new way, but there's a different wealth of connection
Mm.
and connection to the land and connection to each other that I think is far more important than that greenback that we seem to be so interested in these days.
Yeah, that balance, right? I think that's
Yeah,
the key thing is that balance in everything. It doesn't have to be this way or this way. We can find that middle ground. Thus,
I
healing
think we
between
certainly
worlds.
can.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, the girl.
right. So, what are you going to be doing on National Day of Truth and Reconciliation?
um, I haven't decided yet. The last 2 weeks, funny enough, all the evening events and everything that's been going on, it might end up that on Monday that I just take a real nice deep breath.
Mm,
And one of the places that I really like to go to, I like to go to and smudge and do, some ceremony for myself. I really like to go up to Paul Lake, and I like to get my feet in the water and sort of ground myself. And so I think on that day I'll probably do a lot of that. And then we'll see. I might show up at an event or two in community. We'll see.
awesome. So my last question for you is there anything else that you want to add? I mean, the people who are going to be watching this are going to be from all sorts of diverse backgrounds, really. I mean, we're going to send this to our clients, of course, but we can open this up to others. What would you want to share as kind of some parting words?
Um, I would say if you've gotten to the point where you're still watching this video
Yeah.
and because this really is resonating with you, um I always say, like, just keep moving forward. And if you feel like you don't know enough, it's okay. If you feel like disheartened because you didn't even know this was happening through most of your life because it was masked and thrown under the rug, don't beat yourself up about that.
Hmm.
Like, today is a new day. This is a new opportunity. And this is a new choice to move forward in a new way, and in a good way. Do your best to do that every day, and you will find that 2 years down the road, you won't even believe how far you've gone.
Mm.
Those little steps mean everything. And so every day, wake up with intention. And I always talk to Creator or God or whoever, how Buddha, however you see that. Talk to that entity, talk to that energy that's all around us that connects us, and find a way to connect to your source. And once you've done that, everything else will fall into place.
Love it. Those are great final words. And then the final word, which I'm good because we help you with your communications, is where can people find you? How can they reach out to you and learn from you?
People can reach out to my website at healingbetweenworlds.ca. They can also contact me by phone, 250-299-1593. And please reach out, come and see me, ask me any questions you want. And if you or your organization are looking to really, take this on, please reach out to me, and we can help you with that. Because I'm fully immersed in this journey, and I'm willing to walk it with anybody that's willing to start on this course.
Amazing. Thank you, Ryan, for your time, and thank you for your vulnerability, for that grace and that space that you give to people to learn. It's very much appreciated, and you are a catalyst for change to help transform people by walking and healing together. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Lise.